When you think of fairies or elves, what comes to mind? Do you think of Christmas elves, Lord of the Rings elves, Tinkerbell, or the sort of fairies in children's picture books that are just all sweetness and light? Yeah, in old ballads, that's not really what you'll find. In a lot of old folklore, fairies and elves are kind of interchangeable concepts, and there are other names that are used for them as well, often very euphemistic names like the fair folk. When fairies and elves interact with human characters in ballads, often it really doesn't end well for the humans, or at least it becomes a pretty dangerous situation. Here are a few examples from the Child Ballads, the ballads collected by folklorist Francis James Child in the 19th century. Child Ballad number 2 is called The Elfin Knight, as in like a knight in shining armor who's also an elf. It's a story that you might actually be familiar with if you've heard the popular folk song Scarborough Fair. It's not exactly the same, but this is basically a predecessor of that song. The Elfin Knight gives a human woman a list of impossible tasks that she needs to complete, and in response, she gives him a list as well, and so they give each other impossible tasks to do. Unlike in the song Scarborough Fair, where the singer is just giving his ex-lover a long list of impossible tasks, this one has some back and forth. The Elfin Knight gives the human woman a list of impossible tasks, and then she responds with her own list of tasks for him to do, which are also equally impossible. Child Ballad number 4 is called Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, and this one becomes really dangerous for Lady Isabel. She goes off with this strange man who is an elf knight, much like the one in the first ballad that we talked about, and he takes her to a spot either in the woods or by a body of water, where he tells her that he has murdered several women previously, in some versions specifically several king's daughters. She manages to trick him, either by making him turn away or by lulling him to sleep, and then she kills him and leaves him in the same spot where he murdered all those women previously. Child Ballad number 19, King Orfeo, is actually kind of a twist on the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. So in Greek mythology, there was a guy called Orpheus who was in love with a woman named Eurydice, and she died young, and he went to the underworld to try to bring her back. He actually did manage to convince Hades to let her go, but only if he didn't look over his shoulder until they were out of the underworld. And of course he did, and when he looked back, she was bound to stay there and to remain dead. Well, in a very similar way, in the ballad King Orfeo, Orfeo's wife is kidnapped by fairies. He goes to the fairy king and plays his harp, and actually does manage to convince the fairy king to let his wife go, and they actually do manage to go back to their kingdom successfully, unlike Orpheus and Eurydice. Number 37 is called Thomas Rhymer. Thomas meets a woman in the woods who he initially calls the Queen of Heaven, but she corrects him and says that she's actually the Queen of Elfland, and that he has to come with her and live in Elfland and serve her for 7 years, after which he can go back to the human world. Along the way, she shows him 3 diverging paths. One of them is very narrow and difficult, and she calls that the road to heaven. One of them is very broad and very easily traveled, and she calls that the path of wickedness or the path to hell. And then the third one is the road to Elfland, which is where they're going. The same motif with the 3 paths shows up in Child Ballad number 40, The Queen of Elfin's Nourice. In that one, a human woman has been abducted by the elves, and she begs to be allowed to go home to her newborn son. But the Queen of Elfland says, no, you've got to stay here and you've got to nurse my child instead. She does tell her, though, that if she does that, she'll be allowed to go, and she points out the 3 paths, the path to heaven, the path to hell, and the path to Elfland, showing which one they're headed to. Child Ballad 39 is one of the more well-known ones as far as ballads about elves. It's called Tam Lin, and it's about a woman called Janet who goes into a part of the forest that she's not supposed to be in. She picks a rose, and that attracts the attention of Tam Lin, who was originally human but was abducted by the fairies and now has to live among them as a fairy knight. Later on, Janet finds out that she's pregnant and Tam Lin is the father, and she goes to great lengths to free him from the fairies so that they can be married and raise their child together. There's also an aspect of the story that involves the fairies paying a tithe to hell, with the idea being that fairies were kind of demonic and owed their allegiance to the devil, and therefore had to send several of their kind to hell every 7 years. And so the idea is that Tam Lin was abducted and made to become a part of their court so that they could send him instead of one of their own people, and that's what Janet saves him from. Child Ballad number 41 starts off in a very similar way, but then goes a completely different direction. It's about a woman called Margaret who is wandering in the woods where she is not supposed to be and picks nuts from a tree, which attracts the attention of a guy. She ends up staying in the woods with him, and he builds her a bower, basically a place to live, and they have kids together. However, she is miserable, both because she was the daughter of a nobleman and therefore had very different expectations for how her life was going to turn out, and also because she's a devout Christian and her children have not been baptized. So one day her eldest son figures out the whole story of how things happened and who she really is, and he takes her and his younger siblings when the father is out and they go back to her father's house. Now, in the versions collected by Francis James Child, the guy is just a guy. It's implied that he's some kind of criminal or outlaw because she gets him a pardon at the end. However, it's not implied that he's anything supernatural. But there are versions from other countries that have basically the exact same story, except the guy is an elf or some other kind of supernatural being. Which really doesn't surprise me at all because the beginning is so similar to Tam Lin, which in the British version is definitely about fairies. And then finally there's Child Ballad 61, which is about a knight who wants to marry a princess. In order to win her hand in marriage, he's told that he has to stand guard in a particular spot overnight, and basically going to that spot overnight means you're going to have to fight the Elf King, which people don't come back from. So he does fight the Elf King and he comes out victorious, and the Elf King asks him to spare his life, which he does, but he takes the Elf King's sword as proof of what he did so that he can marry the princess. However, in some versions, her father comes up with other tasks for the suitor to complete because he still doesn't want this guy marrying his daughter. So there you have it, elves and fairies in ballads. Very different from, Christmas elves or Tinkerbell type fairies, right? I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays.